Are your team underperforming? Is it leaving you wondering if there's anything you could possibly do to get them out of the slump that they're in? What should you be doing in order to improve their performance? There's 3 simple steps. Check this out. Just lead. Performance management is one of the hardest things that you're gonna have to do as a leader. It's probably why so many people do it so poorly. If you're watching this video because your team already have bad performance, then you're on the back foot. There is so much that goes into performance management that starts prior to poor performance. But don't worry, it is recoverable. If you take these tips and implement them tomorrow, you will get results. But you need to implement them without delay. If you're about to begin a new leadership role and you're just doing this as your preamble before starting the role to work out what you need to do, then well done. There's not too many people out there that are like you, and you need to be congratulated for that. If you're watching this video because you like to keep up with leadership skills and what's new that's out there, well, this video might not be directly for you. However, we all work with people that are bad at performance management. So give this video a like and share it with anyone that you think could use the tips that I'm about to share in this video. Like I say off the top of this video, there are 3 steps you need to be all over when it comes to performance management. You need to set expectations. You need to provide your team with the tools so that they can meet those expectations. And then you need to engage them on their performance. This first step is where most leaders fall down. How can you possibly manage someone's performance if you haven't told them what you expect of them? What your expectations are should be SMART goals. And for those that aren't in the know, SMART means specific, measurable, actionable, relatable, and time-bound goals. We are not a channel here of leadership models, so let's break it down real simple. The basic thing you need out of your expectations is for them to be measurable. Your team either will perform as you expect them to, or they won't perform as you expect them to. And you should be able to get real site-based examples of when they do and don't meet expectations. An example of a bad expectation to set is something vague like, make sure you exhibit company values. While this is a noble expectation of your team, how are you actually going to go and then measure that expectation and their performance? Use the core business of your team and department to guide you when setting your expectations for your team. What does good cohesion look like in your team, and what does good performance look like for your specific team? If you want your team to be someone that really helps each other out, then you need to set that expectation that when someone is struggling in your team, that the expectation is that other team members go and help them. If you've then got someone that is shirking that responsibility, then you've got a stance to take further steps with them. Make your expectations clear. Make sure that you can measure them, and make sure that your employees understand them. Be honest with your team. When you come up with your expectations, make sure you share them with your team, and then make sure that they are on board with those expectations. And make it clear that this is the minimum standard that you expect for anyone that's working for you. And if they aren't on board with these expectations, they are more than welcome to seek other opportunities. Once expectations are set and agreed to, you need to then provide your team with everything they need to succeed. This sounds pretty obvious, but there are blind spots on every car, and you need to be aware of this. When something goes wrong and a team member does something that is below expectations, you need to step back and ask yourself the question, as the leader, did they have everything they required in order to make the right call and meet expectations in that scenario? I'm going to give you 2 similar examples with different outcomes based on whether the team member had the resources they required and whether they did not. In both of these situations, the minimum standard that I set was to work safely on electrically isolated equipment. In this first example, the electrician was required to cut and join a cable in an underground mine. For those that haven't worked in an underground mine before, it's quite confronting the way that cables are run, particularly in the older mines. They all tangle together and they're a bit of a bird's nest, which makes it quite difficult to trace cables. This employee was quite new to the mining game. This was their first mining role. So they did what they were told. They had the work instruction in front of them. They followed it. They used team member advice and guidance in order to follow the steps correctly. They traced the cable as they saw that they needed to, and they felt like they had the right cable. They pulled it down into the basket and they started to remove the sheath, and they removed the steel white armor around the cable. What happened next was they grabbed the volt stick and then tested the cable to make sure that the cable was dead. The volt stick came up with no lights, which means that there was no electricity there. So he proceeded to cut the cable. At which point he was incredibly lucky to keep his life because the cable was still live, and he was very lucky that the protection upstream tripped and cut the power to protect his life. Before anyone asked a question, the volt stick was working. It was tested after the incident. Now, I asked his supervisor when he debriefed me on what happened, what he thought of his employee. Was this standard behavior? Was he careless? Did he tend to behave in this sort of way? And his supervisor backed him in as a pretty good, solid, reliable employee usually. So then we started to dig a little bit further and ask some more questions. Let's have a look at the work instruction. The work instruction itself wasn't very clear on how to use that volt stick and the process that needed to be followed. There was a lot of expectation that that information would be passed on from more experienced employees. See, what he did was use the volt stick perpendicular to the cable when you really need to have it at a bit of an angle in order to pick up something from that cable in terms of electricity. Further to this, there are tools out there that you can use that you can hook to a cable that are basically signal generators. That means that you can positively identify the cable that you have disconnected so that when you go to cut, you can be more certain that you're cutting a dead cable. With all of these things in the back of our minds, we understood that the reason that the cable was live when he cut it was more to do with us not setting that employee up with success. We had to do things like provide them the right tools, make sure the work instruction was up to date and adequate for the task. So those things out of that investigation, we updated that work instruction, and then we made sure that every member of that team had the appropriate tools in order to perform that task safely every time.
This is that part of the video where you like and subscribe because you've liked what I've been doing and you want to see more. Well, there's enough of that. Let's get back to regular programming.
The next example, an electrician had to remove a temporary power supply box from the underground mine. Now, this was a very old box that had been there for a long, long time. There was no need to remove it. We probably weren't going to put it back into service anywhere anyway. But it was the end of shift and it was kind of fill-in work for this employee to do. He went down there, disconnected the panel, removed it from the wall, and then he bagged and tagged the cable, which for those that don't know means he essentially just earthed all the live cores so that if it's ever reconnected, it should instantly trip the power. A couple of days later, a couple of other electricians were down there doing fault finding for a tripped circuit that just wouldn't reset. Once they started to do a bit of research, they found the tails of that cable bound and tagged and realized that it wasn't disconnected at the board. So they disconnected it, were able to reset it, but then reported it through to me to say, hey, I think we've got a bit of an issue here. Then we interviewed the electrician, and when we asked him why he didn't disconnect it from the panel, he said that he tried to trace the cable, but couldn't actually follow it back to the board. So he made sure he tested for dead at the board, found that it was isolated, so then disconnected that cable and removed the box, bagging and tagging and doing what's appropriate for an underground mine. I was left a little bit confused by this and wanted to understand a little bit better, so I went down to the job site. Now, to make it pretty clear, I'm an engineer that has never scuffed up my calluses or skin. I've never actually worked these hands on an electrical job. So I'm not experienced in doing the work, but I needed to understand a little bit better. When I went down to the job site and found that I could trace the cable in less than 5 minutes, it became pretty clear to me that that electrician didn't even try to trace the cable. Just tested, disconnected, and pulled the fan starter out. When we discovered that, we found that to be negligent behavior. He didn't positively isolate that cable before disconnecting that panel. Had no idea where it was connected to, so it could have been turned on at any moment, causing risk to himself. The outcome of that scenario is that that electrician lost his job. And when I interviewed other team members that worked with that person just to see where they're at and follow up further on, I found that it wasn't an isolated case and that he tended to be a lazy employee and take the shortcut and the quick route rather than doing it properly and doing it once. Expectations are set and your team have exactly what they need in order to perform their task well. This is all useless if you refuse to engage your team on their performance. And this is where leaders really let themselves down. They refuse to engage their team on their performance, particularly when it's negative. The key to this step is simple. Document everything, every incident, every action, every behavior. Put it all into their HR file. Making diary notes doesn't really cut it. If your organization has a HR system, you need to ensure that those incidents are documented in that HR system so that it can build a pattern of behavior. You particularly want to do this if you have trouble employees that do little things that aren't necessarily sackable offenses, but when added together and looked at in terms of the weight of probability, you then have the ability to get rid of that employee if that's what you need to do. And if you find a pattern of poor performance in an employee, you might need to put them onto a development plan. And you need to be specific in excruciating detail, set those expectations incredibly clearly. And then any slight deviation from those expectations, document it. Make sure it's clear that it's in their HR file that they have not met your expectations. If the poor performance then still continues, then you need to take steps to remove that person from the business. But you need to have rock hard evidence. You need to have documented everything, because if you let that employee go and it goes to employee court, they're going to find it as a one-off situation and they're going to be returned to your business. And you're going to have to continue to work with them. And that's the negative part, but there is positive too. If you've watched anything on this channel, you know that I like to start with the negative. But going forward, if your team are meeting expectations or exceeding them, you need to acknowledge and recognize that behavior. If your team members are meeting expectations, a verbal acknowledgement from you as the leader should be enough. But when people exceed the expectations that you set, you need to find a really quality way to recognize that behavior. And it's going to be different for every business and every organization based on the complexity and the size of that business. You really need to make sure that you make a big deal of an employee that exceeds expectations and set a standard of recognition and reward. Performance management is hard. You need to start before you think you need to, and then you need to be incredibly consistent in that performance when you do. To understand the importance of consistency as a leader, you need to click this link right here.